Today we're going to talk about how to publish a book. In 2023, there are three main ways to publish a book. And I'm going to break down each one and try to break down the advantages and disadvantages of each method so that you can find the best method for you and so you can publish your book and become another published author in this world. The first and easiest way to publish is to self-publish. Using publishing platforms like KDP, aka Kindle Direct Publishing, Lulu Press, Kobo, iUniverse, Ingram Spark, among others, self-publishing is a fast and immediate way to get your work out there into the hands of potential readers. The second method of publishing is through a small press. For example, presses like Red Hen Press, Soho Press, Unsolicited Press, Future Tense Books, Coffee House Press, 713 Books, Tin House Books, The Feminist Press, Counterpoint Press, Noemi Press, Copper Canyon Press, Milkweed Editions, $2 Radio, Zank Books, Catapult, New Directions, Melville House, etc., etc. The third way to publish a book is in a corporate press, known unaffectionately as the Big Five. These are Penguin Random House, Hachette Books, HarperCollins, Simon & Schuster, Macmillan. Okay, now that I've broken down the three main ways to publish a book in 2023, let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of each method, because they each have pluses and minuses, and you'll want to take these into consideration when you decide what works for you. First off, let's talk about self-publishing. What's great about it is that it's cheap, it's fast, and it's immediate. If you are the kind of writer who craves immediate gratification, and you know who you are, then this method might be perfect for you. You can write a book, you can upload anything from Word documents to PDF files, and literally have your work out into the ether in less than a day. Another thing that's great about self-publishing is that there's no middleman. So there's no obstacles, there's no one getting in the way, there's no gatekeeper stopping you from getting your voice, getting your work out into the hands of prospective readers. For obvious reasons, this can be incredibly appealing and incredibly tempting. Beyond that, for authors who are really dedicated to promoting their own work, self-publishing can also ironically be very profitable. And the simple reason is because there are very few, if any, overhead costs. The only cost that self-published authors are paying is to one of the self-publishing companies, right? And generally speaking, self-published authors make anywhere between 50 and 85%, depending on the company, depending on the contract. That means that that's more money for you to put into your pocket for every title you sell. Beyond that, self-publishing is incredibly good with ebooks, which means that anyone who loves a Kindle, anyone who wants to read your book on their phone, on their tablet, on their desktop, can do so in a matter of seconds. Now, let's talk about some of the disadvantages of self-publishing, because there are quite a few. First thing is money. While I said that you could make really good money self-publishing, that assumes you're willing to work your ass off to promote your work all the time. It also assumes you either have or will have access to a huge community of readers or prospective readers who are willing to spend money on your titles. Now, a lot of self-published authors have no followers in the beginning, and then they build up their readership as time goes on. And that's a legitimate technique if you're willing to put in the time. But lots of authors that I know want to write their book and then have someone else essentially promote it. And if that's the case, then self-publishing is probably not the right path for you. Self-publishing lacks editorial feedback. One of the most valuable experiences with small presses and corporate presses is that authors will get considerable hands-on experience most of the time from editors, sometimes several editors, including copy editors, big picture editors, etc. And each one of these editors will help shape and fine-tune your manuscript in ways that you can't always see and or understand. You can't underestimate the incredible importance of the editorial experience for the simple reason that great editors will see things about your book that you can't see. They will see issues that you haven't even noticed yet. They will see parallels that you haven't even put your finger on. They will know what you're trying to do often before you do. And if they're really good at their job, like a good teacher, they will make you do what you do, but do it better. For this reason, self-publishing can be problematic for a lot of writers who have no opportunity to get better and improve their manuscript because they don't have that invaluable editorial loop of feedback and revision that is often so crucial to creating these fine-tuned manuscripts. Another problem with self-publishing is there's no advance. Yes, you can publish your book in literally 30 minutes, but you'll make no money. You'll have no advance. And all the money you do make will come from your own blood, sweat, and tears. You will have to earn every book that you sell. And even if you decide you don't want to do the work for your self-published books, but you want them to do well, you'll have to hire someone else, a publicist for one that you can afford. For another thing, you'll have to use a book review service like Book Sirens, for example, where you can essentially upload your manuscript and then you pay for a certain number of reviews that they will drop on Amazon and Goodreads, etc. But none of this is free. And if you have a lot of money and you have a number of books that you're self-publishing and you have a lot of titles, this could work for you. But just understand that you won't be able to self-publish, put no money into it, put no time into it, and sell your books almost ever. Of course, there are exceptions, but we can't all expect to be the exception. This is a motif that will keep showing up in this video. There are two other issues with self-publishing that are worth considering. The first is that self-publishing has no PR. Regardless of who you use, these self-publishing platforms are not going to promote your work almost at all. So it will be up to you to find literary venues, media venues that are not only open to small presses, but that are open to self-published presses. There is a bias in some circles against self-publishing, precisely because of the lack of editorial feedback. This means there's no quality control with self-publishing, which means one book might be a masterpiece that deserves the 500,000 people who bought it, but the next book could literally be 3 sentences that aren't even grammatically correct, and both books can be published in the same amount of time. And it's that lack of quality control that can be really dangerous and even problematic in terms of the reputation of self-publishing. Much of it isn't fair, a lot of it is off base, but it's that lack of quality control that often dogs the reputation of self-published titles just in general. So, unless you are willing to stay in it for the long haul and slowly build your readership so that they're willing to buy anything that you sell, self-publishing can be the fastest but often the least lucrative and most frustrating method to publication. But on the other hand, if you're willing to put in the time and the work and to either promote your work and or find someone who will, if you're willing to build your reader base from the ground up, then in the long run, self-publishing could be one of the most profitable ways. But it's also one of the hardest. So you just need to know your odds. You just need to know what you're being asked to do. And you just have to ask yourself, do you have the time and the money to do it? The last thing I should mention about self-publishing is that in some ways it is the least prestigious, precisely because there is no quality control. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, number 2, you can publish your book through a small press. The good thing about publishing your book through a small press is that most of the time you're going to get great editorial feedback. The feedback you will get from small press editors will come in various forms. There will be macro level feedback, there will be micro level feedback, otherwise known as sentence level feedback, there will be stylistic feedback, there will be copy editing feedback. Sometimes small presses have separate editors and copy editors who both are incredible at what they do and can both really help your manuscript. So in general, the feedback you get from a small press tends to be invaluable. Now, there are some exceptions. Some small presses are very hands-off. They respect their authors enough to let them decide the major changes they need to make. Some small presses are so hands-on that it can make authors feel a little oppressed, like they don't even have the right to fight for their own artistic voice, or that the vision that they have isn't being respected enough by the editors who accepted it. Some authors are going to feel like, yo, my book was good enough for you to accept it. Why is it not good enough for you to respect the basic artistic vision? In general, though, the feedback that authors get from small presses tends to be phenomenal. Even if it is a little variable, it tends to be really good, thorough, and involves several levels, several types of editing that end up making a huge difference in the quality and the polish and the luster of that author's final manuscript. Another thing that's great about small presses is that sometimes there's prize money and or royalties. Almost every small press does give its authors royalties, though you should read the fine print because every small press has probably slightly different rules about its royalties. With some small presses, you just get a straight 50% of every book sold. With other presses, you don't get anything until you've sold a minimum. That could be 200 books, sometimes that could be 600 books. And depending on your ambition and how successful your title is, you may never see money from some of these small presses depending on what the contractual language says. So it's important to read the fine print and also just talk about it with your editors once they offer to publish one of your books. Ask them just point blank during one of your meetings on Skype, like, yo, how many books do I have to sell before I start seeing royalties? Or do I get to see royalties from the very beginning? Or is the prize money that I won for winning this contest subtracted from my royalties? Most of the time it's not, but it's still really good for yourself and for your own peace of mind to make sure that you understand the terms. Most of the time this isn't true, but it's still really important, I think, for you as an author who's dying to get your books out there to make sure that you have a deal that's fair and equitable and that will pay you for your art. The question is just, how much cushion does a small press need? Like I said before, every small press has different rules and some are super transparent. Most, I would argue, are super transparent. But be sure to ask for sales of other authors if you're considering a small press. Ask them what the royalty rate is, ask them whether it changes after a certain number of books are sold, etc. Another thing that can be great with small press books is most small presses have a rep, and they have a good rep. Almost every small press that I mentioned before is a really good press and has a great reputation. These presses are respected in the writing community, in the literary community at large, not just by other writers, but by readers, by editors, by agents. In fact, sometimes agents and editors will read books from these small presses to look for a prospective author to add to their catalog in the future. So in general, small presses have the gift of reputation, and that matters a lot because if you're trying to pick between two published authors, you're naturally going to go to the author whose book came out with a press you respect over one you've never heard of, or over a self-published title. Unfortunately, that's just how it works most of the time outside of certain titles in genre fiction. Another thing that's great with small presses is that many small presses have their own buyers list. They have their own list of buyers and readers, and they send emails to anyone who's ever bought a book from them before, or anyone who subscribes to their book box, which is a thing that some small presses do where you subscribe and then you just get every publication that comes out that year. And either way, regardless of what their MO is for finding prospective readers and consumers and clients, the point is that small presses are slowly building their readership over time. And once you publish with them, you get to take advantage of not just the rep of that small press, but of the readership of that small press. And that can be really important. Another thing that small presses can do with some variable level of success is almost all of them have some type of PR department. Sometimes this is just one person who's doing 7 other things for the small press and they're just retweeting your shit on Twitter. And other times their PR person is a professional at what they do and will absolutely push your title to a much higher level of exposure, understanding than it would have had without them. It just depends. Every small press I've ever studied, I've noticed that there's really just a huge range in terms of what they do for PR. Sometimes the PR is minimal, sometimes it is phenomenal, sometimes it's highly disorganized, sometimes it's better than the big five presses. Sometimes they actually get paid for what they do because the small press makes so much money. Often they are volunteers and they make no money at all, and their PR hat is just one of 12 hats that they wear. So the point here is that there is no rule in terms of PR of small presses. The one thing that is consistent is that it's almost always better than what you get as a self-published author because you get nothing. Just saying. Another thing that I personally love about small presses is I think they take the biggest risk in terms of the artistic decisions they make. A small press that loves your book will do everything to fight for your book. They will enter into major contests most of the time. They will enter into small regional contests most of the time. And they will fight for your work. And they do so without any consideration about the economic implications of publishing your book. That's important because when people are writing ambitious books, when people are writing books that really challenge or transgress genre, when people write books that are highly complicated or ambitious, books that deserve to be read and celebrated, but that are often rejected or not even considered in the big five presses, your biggest champion will be small presses. They will fight for great art, whether they make $1 million from your book or whether they make $3 from your book. And that's the kind of person you want in your corner fighting your fights for you. You know what I'm saying? Another thing that's actually neutral, it's neither good nor bad, but it's something just to keep in mind with small presses, is that most small presses tend to specialize in literary fiction. Some of them are changing and are open to certain subgenres of fiction, like certain types of speculative fiction, certain types of historical fiction, certain types of horror, for example. But by and large, most of the small presses listed earlier are focused on literary fiction. So if you're a genre fiction writer, or if you don't know what the hell genre fiction is, both totally understandable things, let me know in the comments and maybe I'll make a video about that sometime in the future. But it is just worth considering that the specific subgenre of fiction that you write, for example, or the specific subfiction of nonfiction that you write often has a huge impact on the response you'll get from small presses. If you write really dope, sexy vampire thrillers, that's great, but most small presses aren't generally open to that kind of book unless it's phenomenally written on a sentence level and does, certain turns of phrases that really turns on the readers of that small press, for example. Okay, as with every type of publishing, small presses have their own disadvantages, and these are some of the things that you should keep in mind for yourself. The first issue that small presses have is often their advance is little to none. Some small presses have book contests, and essentially what they do is they collect a lot of money from each author who submits a manuscript, and then that money forms a pool, and the pool becomes part of the prize for the people that win that contest. It's kind of smart if you think about it, because this way presses don't have to give their own money. They're giving money that they literally just got through the contest. On the flip side though, a lot of small presses don't pay out a lot. That's one issue. For example, if you had a manuscript accepted for publication, there's a very good chance that you will not get an advance. On the flip side, depending on the royalty percentage and the details of the contract, you will probably make a decent amount. It can be anywhere from 10% to 50% depending on the press and depending on the contractual details. But either way, you will make money off of the books you sell. It's just that some presses have different rules for how many you have to sell first, and other presses have different rules on when your royalty rate changes. So the thing to keep in mind is you will usually make money with small presses, but it won't be a lot. And that's just something you have to keep in mind. Another issue with small presses is that sometimes the PR doesn't exist. Some small presses are comprised entirely of volunteers, and they're already doing so much for your book and for other authors' books, and they just don't have the time or the money because they actually have full-time jobs before they even touch a single email. And they often have full-time jobs outside of publishing. So you can't really expect a group of talented, courageous, hardworking volunteers who are book lovers to suddenly figure out how to do PR too. However, some small presses are really good at this. Some small presses have a really developed PR unit. Other small presses treat PR as sort of an afterthought and or as something that's mostly the responsibility of the published author. So this is something to keep in mind. One of the most important things, to go back to an earlier point, is that for many small press authors, they will likely see very little money. Some small press authors never see a cent, either because they didn't publish that many copies of their own book, because they never surpassed the payout threshold listed in the contract that they signed, or simply because after all the overhead expenses are deducted, the amount that a book earns is so little that that author just doesn't make that much. Regardless of the reason, it's just important to keep in mind that you'll have access to readers across the world and you'll have prestige, but most of the time you will not have money. And this is just one of those things that comes with being a small press author. You get the prestige of publishing your book, but you don't usually get the Benjis. But there are notable exceptions. The third and final way to publish is through the Big Five presses. One of the biggest advantages of publishing through a Big Five press is that the production speed is usually faster than a small press. Some authors I know, their book didn't come out in a small press for 2, sometimes even 3 years. But the typical time frame for a book that was bought by an editor by a Big Five press tends to be around 9 to 10 months. That is, from the time that your agent sells your book into the time that the book lands in the bookshelf in a bookstore, averages 9 to 11 months. And that's somewhat faster than a small press. Sometimes small presses have schedules that are 2 years into the future. So when your book is accepted in 2023, the earliest it could come out is the third quarter of 2025. There are exceptions, of course, but this is very common. So for a Big Five author, your shit is going to come out way faster than you think it is. And that's an exciting thing. Another exciting thing about being a Big Five author is that your advances are almost always going to be larger than a small press. It's changed a lot since the beginning of publishing, but until recently, the average advance for an author who published a book in a Big Five press was around $30,000. That is substantially more than what any small press author is getting, considering that many small press authors received no advance whatsoever and received very little or no royalties either. The average Big Five author, on the other hand, tends to make anywhere from $3,000 to $3 million. Now, authors that make those largest advances, they're almost always because of an auction, something that I'm happy to talk about in another episode. But for most authors who publish a book in a Big Five press, they're lucky to have an auction of more than 2 editors. You'd pretty much need a feeding frenzy of like 4 or 5 high-spending editors, senior editors at that, willing to drop some serious cash for you to see those once-in-a-lifetime advances. But you have to keep in mind that those $1 million advances are rare, they're incredibly difficult, and quite honestly, they create unbelievable expectations for that author. Now, that author has to basically justify the advance with everything they do, with every reading, with every book, and they're not allowed to sit it out, even if they wanted to. As I stated before, the average advance used to be around $30,000. Now, it's probably lower than that. It's probably somewhere between like 10 and 25. But the point is, there's a huge range. But there is real money in corporate publishing, which is why there's real money in advances. Obviously, that's a huge perk. One of the best parts about publishing your book in a Big Five press is that there's a lot of prestige connected to that. Part of that is that you can't even sell your books. You can't even submit your books to a Big Five press without an agent. And agents are incredibly hard to get. I'll make a different episode later on about that because just getting an agent in and of itself requires its own video. But suffice it to say that once you have an agent, you've already overcome one of the biggest obstacles for a Big Five author, and that's simply getting representation. So it becomes your agent's job to sell your book to one or a number of editors in one of the Big Five presses. If you're lucky, your agent creates a feeding frenzy with your book and gets a bunch of editors to make competing bids. Most of the time, though, there's going to be a preemptive sale because your agent knows one or two editors and they know certain people who are perfect fits for the kind of books you are publishing. So, while it's great to have an auction, most of the time you won't see that. Most authors I know whose books came out in Big Five presses are just grateful to have sold their book, quite honestly, and it's hard not to blame them. Either way, though, there is definite prestige in publishing a book with a Big Five press. Part of that is just simply needing an agent. Part of that is the intricate process of bidding and auction that goes into acquiring a book. And part of that's the money. And then, of course, there's just the cultural capital of having a book come through a New York publisher, which is where all of the Big Five presses are. Another great part of publishing your book in a Big Five press is that every one of the Big Five presses has a PR team. Now, that doesn't mean the PR team is going to devote a lot of time and money to your title, but it does mean that they have professionals, real accomplished professionals with a huge portfolio of work that they've promoted. It is these PR professionals working in conjunction with your agent who will help your book become a household item. When your agent works together with the PR department of the imprint that's publishing your book, it's these professionals that get your book in all of the major glossies. They're the ones that get you an interview on Good Morning America, that get you an interview on Vanity Fair, that get a huge portrait of you and your book on some massive billboard on the Hudson, etc., etc. All of these things which draw attention to your book, the Big Five presses and their PR department are uniquely qualified to do, and they do their job incredibly well, keeping your book in the public conversation and in the public imagination far longer than most small press authors and certainly self-published authors can do. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that a lot of authors will get neglected by the PR department of their Big Five because the PR department of your Big Five press is going to prioritize the people, the books, the titles they promote. They will not promote all of them equally. And you'll know how important your book is to the publishing company by who they send to meet you. If you meet with the editors and the PR people, then they probably are prioritizing your book. If you meet with an editorial assistant who looks confused or keeps, itching her neck or looking at her phone or waiting for the free donuts to show up, then your book is probably not being prioritized in the PR department. There are a lot of exceptions to this rule, but that's one thing to keep in mind. I have a lot of friends who've published with Big Five presses who were disappointed that their books weren't more prioritized with the PR department. Another thing, simply having a literary agent, especially if it's one of the most prestigious literary agencies, gives you a huge step up in terms of exposure, publicity, and cultural dialogue about your book. This is because your agent knows all the key players in the major literary publications that promote work. So for example, if you have a high-powered agent, not only do they know the editors of the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Paris Review, but they also know the editors of LitHub and all the other journals and magazines, the millions, for example, that focus on the big books coming out. Those hit lists, books to look for in 2025, the Oprah reading list, etc., etc. If you have a high-powered agent, they have contacts in every one of those. And if they don't, they know someone that does. Beyond that, having a high-powered agent can just do wonders for you in terms of getting interviews, in terms of getting your book even considered in the New York Times book review, for example. So publishing with the Big Five press in conjunction with having a really great agent will make a world of difference for you. If you haven't noticed already, there's a repeating theme here, culturally speaking, and that's that most of the best-known agents and all of the Big Five presses are all in New York City. So as you can imagine, there is prestige to having a book come out in a New York press for an obvious reason. New York has an obscene concentration of corporate publishing houses, corporate imprints, and literary agencies. And the vast majority of them are all within 40 blocks of each other. Publishing with the Big Five press, on the other hand, does have its own disadvantages. And these are worth considering as you make the best choice for yourself. One thing that's problematic about Big Five publishing is that you need an agent, and getting a literary agent is incredibly hard. Even more insane, even if you get a great agent, your agent might not be able to sell your book. I speak from personal experience here. I had an agent in 2016 I loved her, I respected her. She was one of the first people to give my novel a chance. It was ambitious, it was multimodal, it had androids and cults and ninjas, and it was postmodern, and it had a self-aware voice, which I personally loved. And she was one of the first people to see it. But even though she and I worked together for a year to revise it, and even though she could see its infinite potential, we couldn't get an editor to buy it. And once that happened, we split up. And this happens a lot. Believe it or not, agents and writers split up often when an agent can't sell your book. Unfortunately, this happens quite a lot. So getting an agent in and of itself is incredibly difficult. There's a lot of steps to follow. There's submission guidelines. There's a word count. Beyond that, agents are getting upwards of 50 to 100 query letters every single day. There's no legitimate way to wade through 3 to 30,000 literary agent queries, but these agents have to find a way. A lot of times that involves their editorial assistants simply going through and quickly sending form rejections to everything they get. Beyond that, even if you get an agent, you actually need a good agent, preferably a great agent, because there's this phenomenon that's been happening in the past 20 years where a lot of former editors of imprints are now agents. Why? Because they have tons of contacts in their own imprint and they know most of the primary editors and primary players in the industry. So it's easy for them to sort of connect their authors and connect their clients with editors who they have professional relationships with. Why does this matter? Because editors aren't paid enough. And because of this, a lot of editors are now agents. So getting a good agent technically has never been easier because of the number of agents. But in other ways, it's never been harder because there's never been more prospective writers. So many Americans want to be writers. There are thousands of MFA programs. There's 30, 40 PhD programs in creative writing. Everyone has a voice. Everyone has a manuscript. Everyone wants an agent. And for that reason, you are competing with thousands of query letters. But even if you get an agent, your agent has to be phenomenal at their job. They have to know all the principal players. They have to have formed professional relationships with the senior editors of all the major imprints. And more importantly, they have to know what kind of editors are going to respond most positively to the types of books that you are trying to sell. A great agent knows exactly who's receptive to your work. A good agent has an idea. A bad agent just simply sends it to anyone. So not only do you need an agent, you need a great agent who has a track record, who has a list of books they've already published, and who's respected in the industry. This will make their job of selling your book a lot easier. Problem though, is most of the great agents already have a full client list. They're not necessarily looking for a new writer, and when they do, they're usually like loitering around the halls of Iowa Writers Workshop or Columbia. They're not usually looking for you or me, which is part of the problem. Beyond that, the rejection rate is staggeringly high for not just manuscripts sent to a Big Five press, but to literary agencies. Unless you're a celebrity, you are going to have a very, very difficult time publishing your book. Male authors right now are going to have a unique challenge as well, because for a lot of historically important reasons, women's writers have been centered as they should. And that's going to place some unique obstacles in your path if you're a male author that you have to understand, accept, and overcome. If the first book you published with the Big Five press bombs, the problem is that a lot of editors may not consider your second book. This is because they're going to use Nielsen BookScan stats, and they're going to look up how many copies you sold. And if they see that you sold 3,000, 4,000 copies, which is phenomenal for a small press, but really bad for a large corporate press, some of these editors are going to reject your manuscript even if they love it, even if they believe in you, simply because they don't think you're going to sell enough copies. One of the biggest issues with Big Five presses is that it's literary capitalism at its best and worst. Some of these million-dollar advances that you see aren't going to writers writing in their own voices. They're going to authors writing in other voices. American Dirt, need I say more? But beyond that, it's a business. And the Big Five press is a business. This means that some authors who have no talent but who have 3 million followers on YouTube are going to get their books accepted simply because the number of followers they have is going to equate to some minimum level of book sales. Other books which are phenomenal, ambitious, important, possibly the greatest thing those editors have seen all year, are going to be rejected simply because the author didn't sell enough books with their first book. When I was an editorial intern, I listened to senior editors talk about book sales before anything else. It was the first thing discussed, not the last. And this can be really disheartening for a lot of aspiring writers. The last issue that mostly affects writers of color and other people who belong to a specific minority category is the Big Five press is still overwhelmingly dominated by cis-het white women. And if you are a cis-het white woman, that's a good thing because I think you actually have an advantage in some ways. You're going to publish things that other women who have a similar demographic can connect to. But if you're like me, you're mixed race, you're Asian, you're white, you're demisexual, you're the son of a Japanese immigrant, etc., etc., the truth is you're going to have some unique disadvantages. And this isn't my opinion or whatever. If you just look at the book sales of Asian American women authors and Asian American male authors, it's very clear that white women love Asian American women writers. Now, some people are going to say, well, what's the problem with that? And that's a fair question. My thing is, I just want the publishing industry to reflect the diversity of this country, just as I want the catalogs to represent the sheer diversity of American voices. I know a lot of Asian American male writers, but their books aren't out. I'll create a separate episode another time because I do think there's something to be said about the role that Orientalism plays in publishing and how it appeals to certain white women editors. But that's a different discussion for another time. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that if you are not a white, cis-het female author, you may encounter some obstacles. It might be something as benign as the editor just doesn't understand your context. The editor doesn't understand the history that you're talking about in your book. But it could be something as pernicious as the editor is hostile to your story because it contradicts their limited understanding of your own culture and or identity. And the truth is, either way, the rejection will look exactly the same. The rejection doesn't say, sorry, I'm not educated enough to understand the cultural perspective that you delineate in your book. The rejection is not going to say, sorry, this doesn't compute with what I think I understand about Japanese Americans, even though I don't know any. Or I had one friend in college, but we haven't talked since our days at Princeton, etc., etc. The point is, your rejection won't tell you most of the time why it was rejected. There will be words like infatuation, I didn't love it, but ultimately, the demographic overrepresentation of white, mostly straight women is one of the biggest problematics of the publishing industry, and for many writers, it will adversely affect them. So that is my quick and dirty summary of the 3 basic ways in which you can get published and some of the advantages and disadvantages of each method. Let me know in your comments your own experiences. Feel free to post questions, and I'll be happy to create another video in the future addressing some of these other issues like how to get an agent, how to find the right small press for you, and other things like that. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. I wish you all the best of luck. Feel free to drop some questions in the comments. If there's something you're particularly interested in and or you want more information, hit me up. I'm happy to consider ideas for future videos. And with that said, keep writing, don't stop, find the right place for your own voice, find the right place for your books, and I wish you all the best luck. Ganbatte!